number one suggestion to the people looking at improving in reading comprehension is read. So read journals, read magazines, books on topics with which you are not very familiar. So for example, a science grad should focus on, let's say, history, literature, psychology, or business articles. Then a business grad should read, let's say, science journals and humanities. And a humanities expert could delve into science and business journals. So basically, this will help you get familiar with the vocabulary of the field. For example, in the passage we are going to discuss today, a science grad may not understand what suffrage is, and that would make the passage 10 times harder than what it actually is. Normally, we need about 2 complete reads to fully understand what the passage is saying, but if you do not understand the topic being discussed, it will take you multiple reads to pick up those clues, right? You will waste so much time. So read, and read. RC does not improve after 2-3 sessions. It improves by consistently reading for a few months. Now, by any standards, this is a tough question. We will evaluate it line by line and then go on to the questions. Recent feminist scholarship. What is scholarship? Scholarship is knowledge. It's not just the money that you get for doing well. It is knowledge is also called scholarship. So recent feminist scholarship. Again, this is terminology of humanities, normally used in humanities. And in case you're not aware of it, this could be a little confusing. So concerning the United States in the 1920s, so we're talking about US in the 1920s, challenges earlier interpretations that assess the 20s in terms of, okay, so we are talking about some earlier interpretations and we are talking about the recent knowledge. So recent knowledge is challenging the earlier interpretation. So then let's write down what the earlier interpretation said and what the recent knowledge says. So the earlier interpretations assess the 20s in terms of the unkept promises of the women's suffrage movement. So earlier interpretation said that there were unkept promises of the women's suffrage movement. What is suffrage? It's the right to vote. Again, if you are not familiar with this, it could be a little confusing to begin with. There are enough clues in the passage, but yes, if the first sentence itself doesn't make a whole lot of sense, it's just difficult. As I've said before, we tend to glance over the first sentence and we forget it by the time we reach the end of the passage, but it is extremely important. Normally, one question would be based on the first sentence of the passage. Okay. So, the earlier interpretation said that the suffrage had some unkept promises, whereas recent knowledge, it challenges this earlier interpretation. So challenges this unkept promises thing. Yeah, this promises agenda. Okay, this new scholarship disputes the long-held view. Okay, so what is the long-held view? This is the earlier interpretation we are talking about, right? This we can also say is the long-held view. It disputes the long-held view that because a women's voting bloc did not materialize. So it says that voting bloc did not happen. All right. So after women gained the right to vote in 1920, suffrage failed to produce long-term political gains for women. So no political gains, long-term political gains for women. Okay, here the recent knowledge, we are given that it disputes that there were no political gains. So here it disputes that there were no political gains. So basically the recent knowledge says that there were perhaps some political gains. All right. Now, these feminist scholars, again, we're talking about the same, these recent feminist scholarship, right? We're talking about these people, the recent knowledge, these feminist scholars. Yeah. also challenged the old view that pronounced suffrage a failure for not delivering on the promise. Okay, so also challenge the old view. So what is the old view? Again, the earlier interpretation that pronounced suffrage a failure. So the old view said that suffrage was a failure because for not delivering on the promise that the women's vote would bring about moral corruption-free governance. So suffrage was a failure because no moral corruption-free governance. Right? So it did not happen. The earlier interpretation says the suffrage was a failure because it did not bring moral corruption-free governance. So, but the feminist scholars, they challenge this old view. So they challenge this old view as well. Now, asked whether women's suffrage was a failure, what old view do they challenge? That suffrage was a failure. They challenge this. They say that is not correct. These scholars cite the words of turn of the century social reformer Jane Addams. Why don't you ask if suffrage in general is failing? So the feminist scholars are saying that instead of worrying about why women's suffrage did not bring in the moral corruption-free governance, why don't you worry about why suffrage, that is the voting in general, did not bring about moral corruption-free governance, right? So once we have democracy, people are voting, then you should have a moral corruption-free governance. It doesn't really matter whether women's voting brought that or not, isn't it? We can't really focus on who is voting, whether just the men are voting or both are voting. The point is that suffrage itself, voting, the right to vote for people itself, democracy itself should bring in moral corruption-free government. And if it is not bringing in, we need to worry about that. That is the point. That is actually the question, right? So that is how they respond, by giving us this question by Jane Addams. Okay. So this is what our first paragraph says. Now, second paragraph. In some ways, however, these scholars still present the 1920s as a period of decline. So these scholars, we're talking about this recent knowledge about the feminist scholars, right? They still present 20s as a period of decline. Okay. After suffrage, they argue the feminist movement lost its cohesiveness and gender consciousness waned. So they're saying that after in 1920, women got the right to vote, then there was a period of decline because the feminist movement, it lost its cohesiveness, then gender consciousness waned. You know, they were not people, the feminists at that time were not trying to do things for the women especially. Then after the mid-1920s, few successes could be claimed by feminist reformers. That is, little could be seen in the way of legislative victories. So they're saying that, you know, after mid-1920s, there were no legislative victories, right? No new laws came in which helped women, which improved the lot of the women, etc. So this is what the feminist scholars, the recent scholars say. During this decade, however, there was intense activism aimed at achieving increased autonomy for women. So now starts what the author is saying. This is what the author's opinion is. This is what he's saying. He says, oh, look over here. Now it makes sense, right? Over here, he said that these scholars still present 20s as a period of decline. But he says, however, now he doesn't agree with these recent scholars, these recent feminist scholars that we were talking about. The author does not agree with them that 20s was a period of decline. With these points, he doesn't agree. Right? He says during this decade, there was intense activism aimed at achieving increased autonomy for women, broadening the spheres within which they lived their daily lives. Women's organizations work to establish opportunities for women. So women's organizations were working for more opportunities for women. They strove to secure for women the full entitlements of citizenship, including the right to hold office and the right to serve on juries. So he is, his opinion is conflicting with this, with what the recent scholars said over here. He says it's not true that it was a period of decline. The reformers were working to improve the lot of the women. This is what our author thinks, and this is in this paragraph, in the third paragraph, he tells us what his opinion on the matter is. So let's go on to the questions now. Question 1. The passage is primarily concerned with. So before we jump into the options, think about what is the passage saying? Why did the author write the passage? Look, so initially he tells us about how the recent scholars, they are challenging the earlier interpretations, the long-held views, right? This is what he does in paragraph 1. Then in paragraph 2, he talks about how even the recent scholars feel that 20s was a period of decline. And then in paragraph 3, he tells us his own view that it was not actually an era of decline. And he challenges what this particular aspect of what the recent scholars are saying, right? So this is what he wanted to do, and this is why he wrote this particular passage. Okay, so let's look at the options now. Providing evidence indicating that feminist reformers of the 1920s failed to reach some of their goals. No, he is not trying to provide us evidence. In fact, what he wants to say is that the reformers of the 1920s actually did a great job, right? He is not looking for evidence to say that these guys failed, isn't it? When he gives his own view, he says that they did achieve a whole lot. Okay, B, presenting scholarship that contrasts, again, scholarship is knowledge. So presenting knowledge that contrasts suffragist promises with the historical realities of the 1920s. So he's not giving us the contrast between the promises and the historical realities. He did give us the historical realities, but he's not presenting them as a contrast between the suffragist promises, right? What are the promises that they're talking about? For example, this promise, they did not deliver on the promise that the women's vote would bring about moral corruption, free governance, right? So he's not saying that as against this, he's not contrasting the two, isn't it? So that is why, again, this is not the appropriate answer. Okay, option C, discussing recent scholarship concerning the achievements of women's suffrage. Well, he does discuss recent knowledge, what the current feminist scholars are saying during the 1920s, and presenting an alternative view of those achievements. Now, this is what he does do, right? In the third paragraph, he presents his own view of those achievements, and he does discuss what the recent scholars are saying about the achievements of the women's suffrage, right? So then he does do both these things, right? Both these discussing recent scholarship concerning the achievements, this is valid, and presenting an alternative view, this is also valid. So this certainly looks good. Let's put it on the side. Outlining recent findings concerning events leading to suffrage for women in the 1920s. Well, he doesn't tell us how suffrage came about in the 1920s, right? So certainly, I mean, he has to tell us how, for this to be true, it has to tell us about the events leading up to suffrage, but it doesn't. It just tells us what is the old interpretation, what the recent scholars are saying, and what he says. Providing support for a traditional view of the success of feminist attempts to increase gender consciousness. Well, he's not providing support for a traditional view. The traditional view says that suffrage was a failure, right? He is not saying that. He says that there were quite a few successes. The recent scholars are saying that there were a lot of successes, and then he gives his own interpretation of those as well. Even though recent scholars, look at this again, he says that even though recent scholars still present 1920s as a period of decline, right? Here he says still presented as a period of decline, but he says during this decade, however, there was intense activism aimed at achieving increased autonomy, right? Correct. So then, certainly he's not providing support for a traditional view of the success of feminist attempts to increase gender consciousness among women during the 1920s. So then this also does not work. Then our answer must be option C only. Okay. Look at question 2. it can be inferred that the author of the passage disagrees with the new scholarship. Well, he does disagree with the new scholarship, right? He says it's not a period of decline. It was not a period of decline. And then he gives us how it was really successful. Mentioned in the lines 6 to 7 regarding. So what is the new scholarship? Here, in lines 6 to 7, so here is our line 5. This new scholarship disputes the long-held view that because the women's voting bloc did not realize, the suffrage failed to produce long-term. So basically, the entire, this one, recent knowledge, right? All the points that we discussed over here, the question is asking that what does the author disagree with, right? We know that he disagrees with this part of it, right? That 20s was a period of decline, and there were no legislative victories, and etc. Here, whatever this second paragraph, he disagrees with. Right? He doesn't agree with what the recent scholars are saying over here. Okay, so let's jump back to our question. So in which aspect does he disagree? So he disagrees regarding the degree to which the promises of the suffrage movement remain unkept. No, there is no such discussion, right? He doesn't say that the suffrage movement did keep its promises to a large extent, whereas recent scholars did not say that it did to a smaller extent, etc. And no such discussion. Degree to which suffrage for women improved the morality of governance. Again, no such discussion, right? He is not talking about the morality of governance. He doesn't disagree over there. Degree to which the 1920s represented a period of decline for the feminist movement, right? So he says that it was not a period of decline, isn't it? He very clearly says over here in paragraph 2 that these scholars still present 1920s as a period of decline, whereas he says there was intense activism. He says it was not a period of decline, and he tells us how it was successful, right? So certainly makes sense. Okay, let's look at the other two options as well. Degree of legislative success achieved by feminist reformers during the 1920s. No. So he is not giving us information about what kind of, whether there was, how much legislative success did they achieve, isn't it? Right? So again, not correct. Then E, accuracy of the view that a women's voting bloc did not materialize once suffrage was achieved. No, again, he does not disagree over here. The new reformers, they disagree with the old interpretation of what happened because voting bloc did not materialize. Nobody is disagreeing on whether the voting bloc materialized or not. So again, this is not the answer. So for option D over here, just in case you're a little confused, because it does confuse people sometimes, note over here that he is not contradicting the degree of legislative success, right? Look at that. They say that little could be seen in the way of legislative victories over here. And he says that they strove to secure for women the full entitlements of citizenship, etc. Right? He's not saying that, well, they did get legislative victories, right? So that is why your option D is not correct. So let's go on to question 3 now. The purpose of the second paragraph of the passage is to. Now, if you remember, what did the second paragraph talk about? That the recent scholars, they still consider 20s to be a period of decline, whereas the author thinks that it was not so. Okay, let's look at the options. Suggest a reason why suffragist promises were not kept. Well, he does not suggest that. Contrast suffragist promises with the reality of the 1920s. Again, no contrast given of the promises with the reality. Deplore the lack of successful feminist reform in 1920s. Okay, now what is the meaning of deplore? It means to lament, to regret, to say, oh, it did not happen, right? That's not true. He wants to give us the opinion of the recent scholars in that they consider it to be a period of decline, right? He does not want to deplore the lack of successful feminist reform. Okay. Explain a view held by feminist scholars. So yes, he does explain the view held by feminist scholars, because in the next paragraph, he then contradicts that view. He gives his own opinion on how that view is not correct, right? So this certainly seems good. Now answer the question asked by Jane Addams. Well, of course not. There is no relevance of this. So then the answer must be option D. Okay, question 4. It can be inferred from the passage that recent scholars are the ones who contradict the old interpretation, right? Cite the words of Jane Addams primarily in order to. So why do they cite the words of Jane Addams? Let's see. A. Suggests that women's achievement of suffrage brought about changes in government that were not taken into account by early interpretations. Well, no, nothing like that, right? The recent scholars cite the words of Jane Addams to answer when people ask why the women's suffrage did not bring in a moral government. So their point is, why did suffrage itself not bring in a moral government, right? So that has to be the focus point. That is why they brought in Jane Addams' comment, right? So point out contradictions inherent in the goals of the women's suffrage movement. Now, there are no contradictions that they suggest, isn't it? Let's just keep it on the side. We'll see. Now, show why a women's voting bloc was not formed when women won the right to vote. That they do not point it out to show why the voting bloc was not formed. There is no relevance to the voting bloc when they mention Jane Addams. Okay, emphasize the place of social reform movements in the struggle for suffrage for women. Now, again, there is no such social reform movement relevance to Jane Addams' word. So that is why this is also not correct. Okay. Suggests that the old view of women's suffrage was inappropriate. Well, look, that does make a little bit of sense, because why did they bring in the comment by Jane Addams? Because they want to suggest that the old view of women's suffrage, what was it? That suffrage was expected to bring in a moral government. The point is that they were saying that is not appropriate to even to believe that women's suffrage should bring in a moral government, right? The point is that suffrage should bring in moral government. When everyone has the right to vote, when people have the right to vote, then you should get moral, ethical government, isn't it? That the point is, why with the right to vote do we not get a moral, non-corrupt government, right? So they said that expecting this from women's suffrage alone, that is inappropriate. That isn't really the right way to go about it. Let's look at B a little once more. Point out contradictions inherent in the goals of the women's suffrage movement. Look, it doesn't point out any contradictions, right? As such that, it doesn't say that it cannot be achieved. In case, let's say, we were given, or the passage gave us that it is not possible to achieve a moral, non-corrupt government, and the women's suffrage promised that there will be a moral, non-corrupt government, then there would be an inherent contradiction, right? But then, since it is not given to us that it is not possible to have a moral, non-corrupt government, what Jane Addams was mentioned to say that actually suffrage itself should have given a moral, non-corrupt government, and we have to focus on why it did not, right? So that is why, since there are no inherent contradictions pointed out, that is why option B is not appropriate, but option E is certainly better. Now, not a very easy question to answer, I agree, but then as we saw, it is certainly the best out of the lot. Let's look at question number 5. It can be inferred that the analysis of the author of the passage and the scholars mentioned in lines 20 to 23 differ with regard to which of the following. So, okay, which are the scholars mentioned in lines 20 and 23? We have line 20 over here. So they are talking about these scholars, right? They argue the feminist movement. So we're talking about the recent scholars, right? And we know that what is it that they disagree with? They think that 20s was a period of decline, whereas our author thinks that it was a period of achievement, right? Achieving great increased autonomy, etc. All right. So then, option A, the criteria they used to evaluate the success of the feminist movement during the 1920s. Well, right. So there are reasons that the scholars have given why they think that feminist movement was not very successful. They thought it was a period of decline, whereas our author thinks that it was a period of success. So let's just put this aside, right? He gives different criteria, isn't it? He says that a lot was done, that there was intense activism, then activism aimed at achieving increased autonomy and broadening the spheres within which they lived their daily lives and stuff. So he's talking about some different aspects in which it was a really successful era, whereas they are talking about, let's say, feminist movement lost its cohesiveness and gender consciousness wane, right? So basically, they are using different criteria to evaluate the success of the feminist movement. So, okay, let's put it aside. Let's go ahead. Their interpretation of the promises of the suffragist movement, of course, no such discussion, right? They don't talk about, the different interpretations of the promises. Okay, then the suggestions they make for achieving feminist goals, again, no such different suggestions given by them. It's their different interpretations of how that 1920s panned out. Now, their definitions of what constitutes a legislative victory, again, no. He does not say that there were many legislative victories, right? If you recall, again, he says they strove to secure for women the full entitlements of citizenship, including the right to hold office. And he doesn't say that they did get the legislative victories. And they also say that little could be seen in the way of legislative victories. So certainly, their definitions of what constitutes a legislative victory is not the point of difference. Now, E, their estimates of the obstacles preventing women's having achieved a voting bloc in the 1920s. Okay, no discussion of the voting bloc and why they did not achieve that, etc. So this is also incorrect. Then, of course, our answer must be option A only. All right, let's look at question number 6. The new scholarship mentioned in the first paragraph suggests, we are talking about new scholarship as a recent scholars, the new knowledge, right? Suggests which of the following concerning the promises mentioned in lines 4 to 5. Okay, so we're talking about this recent scholarship and the unkept promises of the women's suffrage movement. Here, we're talking about these unkept promises, right? And which promises were there? So we have the promises here, not delivering on the promise that the women's vote would bring about moral corruption, free governance, and all that. Okay, so now, which of the following concerning the promises? A failure to keep these promises is not a measure of the success of the suffrage movement. Well, certainly, this is correct. They do agree, they do say that failure to keep these promises is not a measure of the success of. So look here, these feminist scholars also challenge the old view that pronounced suffrage a failure for not delivering on the promise, right? Whereas, so they challenged that suffrage was a failure because it did not deliver on the promise, isn't it? So then failure to keep these promises is not a measure of the success of the suffrage movement. They do believe that, right? So this is certainly, looks good. Let's go to B. Failure to keep these promises caused the feminist movement to lose cohesiveness during the 1920s. Not mentioned that because this promise was not kept, that is why they lost cohesiveness. They do say that they lost cohesiveness, but they don't say that it is because these promises were not kept, that is why. Option C, failure to keep these promises led recent feminist scholars to re-evaluate the success of the suffrage movement. No, they say that the suffrage movement was a success despite of this failure to keep these promises, right? So certainly not the answer. These promises included securing for women the right to hold office and the right to serve on juries. We don't know what promises were included here. We are talking about the promises that the suffrage movement supposedly did not keep. So, not the answer. These promises were of little importance in winning suffrage for women. Again, doesn't say. Nobody says that. We have no clue. So, this is also not the answer. So, answer is certainly option A. Well, that wasn't easy. So go through the passage once again on your own and also go through every option of every question to understand why it was eliminated or accepted as the answer.